Welcome to our webinar and our session on understanding private equity. I'm Matthew Mendelson, the CEO at Social Capital Partners, and we're very happy to be presenting this conversation with some of the leading experts on this issue, and we're really happy to be co-presenting this with the Canada Anti-Monopoly Project, otherwise known as CAMP. Because both organizations are really preoccupied with the question of how the structure of the economy, the ownership of the economy is changing, and a lot of those changes are taking place without a lot of attention. This event is intended to help policymakers and the general public better understand what's going on with some of the underlying structures of the economy, who's owning things, and who is building wealth and who is not. So with that, I'm really happy to, I should just remind everyone that this session is being recorded. And with that, I will sign off and I'll turn it over. We're very lucky to have Ana Pereira from the Toronto Star hosting this. Thank you, Ana.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm so excited to be here today with all of you. So let's get right to it. I'd like to start by asking Rachel to contextualize things for us. What is PE, Rachel, private equity, and what motivated you to write a paper on it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So private equity is a very vague term, but really it's a collection of financial investments from investors outside of the stock market. So people invest their money in the stock market, but you can also invest your money in private businesses that aren't publicly traded. So private equity is a vague term for this industry that has been created of investing trillions of dollars. So the private equity industry is actually worth about $10 trillion globally, between assets under management and dry powder, which is money they haven't yet invested yet. So it's just this collection of money invested in private companies. So I wrote this paper after working almost 10 years in Bay Street as a private equity lawyer, working in mergers and acquisitions, either for the PE firms or for their portfolio companies that they owned. And I saw how much money was being made, and I saw how they were making all that money. And you step back 10,000 feet and you really can see the bigger picture. So small businesses in Canada and across the world are being consolidated. And businesses that were traditionally owned and operated by their owners are now being owned by investors. And so we're now financializing the private market, which is something we've not really been used to before. And so now these investors are the ones calling the shots. They used to be more passive, but now these investors are the ones calling the shots on how these businesses are being run, and who owns a company really matters. While this is happening in Canada, like I said, this is a global issue. And I think it's really important for Canadians to understand this, because CPP, our pension fund, is also the second largest private equity investor in the world. So for Canadians, I think it's really important for us to have this conversation. One, because what is this industry? What is it doing to our economy? And how can we protect ourselves against it? But also understanding that we are playing a big role in hurting other economies. So it's really important that we bring this to light and have these discussions.
$10 trillion is such a crazy number. I can't even conceptualize that amount of money. Can you break down for us the different kinds of private equity and why we're going to focus on buyout private equity today?
Yeah. So buyout is the biggest sector of private equity, but buyout is not the only sector. So private equity, like I said, it's just investing in companies. So they invest in startups all the way to bankrupted companies, bringing them back to life. So private equity inherently is not bad. We need people to invest in our economies. But buyout private equity is the sector where they're not investing in the business, they're extracting from the business, because the business has grown to be so stable and large that to grow it would take such an investment or take such time that the fund is not going to be able to profit in the lifetime of their investment. So they extract. And that's when they're selling real estate or they're loading companies up with debt And that's not productive for our economy. So that's really the buyout segment, is buying companies 100%, loading them up with debt. So they're not buying the company at face value. They'll pay 10% of the purchase price, load it up with debt, and use that debt to pay the balance of the acquisition price. And then through the life of their investment, they will use tools and tactics that I spell out in my paper on how to take value out and enrich themselves at the expense of the communities, the employees, customers, and the environments in which they operate.
So for people who might not be familiar with this concept, can you give us an example of how it works in practice, and maybe compare examples here in Canada to the rest of the world?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a really good example and use easy numbers. So let's say I want to buy a business for $10 million. I'm not going to actually go and write a check for $10 million. I'm going to go write a check for $1 million. And then I'm going to go get a loan. The business, not me, the business is going to go take out a loan. And that loan is going to be for $9 million. Well, if let's say I'm using a simple interest rate of, let's say 5% over 10 years, that's going to be $100,000 a month that business is paying in debt service obligations. That's $100,000 a month that business doesn't have to raise wages, invest in machines, or even just to meet the operational expenses that business has. So they're siphoning cash flow out of the business and putting that into their own pockets. So this is throughout the entire economy. My stepson takes a school bus to school every day in Guelph from a private equity owned company. And he's been late to school multiple times because they don't have enough drivers. Presumably they don't have enough, they're not paying enough, because we have such high unemployment in Canada that I'm sure they could find a bus driver if they were willing to pay appropriately. Dentists, vets, funeral homes, even WestJet was bought by private equity. There's no company too big or too small that they have not been able to get their hands on. And so what we're trying to do is really show the impacts of a financialized economy. So we know the stock market, we know how the stock market operates, but those same shareholder maximization, maximizing value is being put into the private market, where we used to have a lot of owner-operator business models. You just go to your dentist owns the business. But now your dentist is now going to be accountable to a financial investor who has a growth target they want to hit. So maybe your dentist might sell you on a test that you maybe don't need, or some extra treatment that is optional that maybe you don't have the disposable income to be paying for. So adding this level of returns into a business that never really had to deal with it is a completely new phenomenon that our legal systems, our financial systems are not prepared to address.
So pretty much everywhere we look, there's private equity. I'd like to turn it over to Jim Baker. He's the executive director of the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. And I'm hoping, Jim, that you can shed an extra light on what buyout PE is from the work that you do in your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Appreciate it, and appreciate the chance to participate in this panel today. So Jim Baker, Executive Director of the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. We are the main watchdog group focused on impacts of private equity firms, private equity on people and the planet. Private equity firms raise funds, mostly from institutional investors like pension funds, endowments, foundations, insurance companies, ranging from funds ranging from hundreds of millions of dollars to as much as $30 billion, $30 billion US dollars. The private equity firm often puts very little of its own or its executives' money into the fund, often just 1 to 2%. The fund then expects to generate returns over the next 10 years or so, right? So the private equity firm, they've raised the fund, they go looking for companies to invest in with that fund, from small companies to in some cases, large publicly traded companies, based on the type of private equity fund it is. When a private equity fund buys a company, as Rachel said, it generally uses a little of its own money, a little of the money from that private equity fund, and a lot of debt. Private equity firms, they generally acquire majority stakes in companies, right? This is important. It means they have control over the day-to-day operations of the company, over the strategic direction of the company. But yeah, like I said, majority of the capital is debt. So Rachel referenced WestJet, which was acquired by Onyx, a private equity firm in 2019 for $5 billion. The majority of that, over $3 billion, was debt. The important point is that it's the acquired company, for example, WestJet in that case, not the private equity firm, that's responsible for paying back the debt, that's on the hook, for paying back that debt if things aren't working out so well. The private equity firm then tries to grow cash flow. So they've acquired the company. They didn't try to grow cash flow at the acquired company really as much as possible over the next 4 to 6 years. A couple different ways they can do that, right? They can grow revenue, by winning new business or customers. They can also grow revenue by acquiring competitors, acquiring other companies. And then the other option, obviously, if they're trying to grow cash flow, is to cut expenses, trying to reduce labor costs, for example. Along the way, the private equity firm can extract value through dividends, fees, and other tactics. The private equity firm then tries to sell the company after, typically 4 to 6 years for a profit or take it public through an IPO. Generally, private equity funds are looking to double or triple the value of their investment over that period of 4 to 6 years, right? So they're trying to substantially grow the value of their investment stake in the company over that period of time. They then take a portion of the proceeds for themselves, distribute the rest to investors, and then that kind of cycle happens over and over and over again. It doesn't really depend on, whether it's an airline, whether it's an oil pipeline, whether it's an apartment building, whether it's a, doctor's practice. It doesn't really matter. It's that same cycle over and over again.
So, Jim, explain something to us. If this cycle is repeating and the private equity firm wants to extract value from these companies, how is it possible that there's somebody who wants to buy this firm at the end of the cycle? Like, if people are constantly removing value from this business?
So I would say a couple of things, right? So we are seeing increasing numbers of sales of companies from one private equity firm to another one, right? So, increasingly common, you'll see a sale of a company to a private equity for a company taken over by a private equity firm and then sold to another private equity firm. And often we see, similar types of kind of over and over again, similar types of kind of tactics to extract value. So those could be adding additional debt to the company's balance sheet to pay a dividend to the private equity firm. It could be significant fees, acquisition fees, monitoring fees that are collected from the firm, right? So it's sort of from the perspective of the private equity firm, there are kind of multiple ways and multiple means to sort of extract value. They obviously are, like I said, back to what I said before, like they're looking to grow cash flow from the company along the way. But I think what we've seen in recent years is private equity firms have gotten increasingly creative in finding ways to extract value from companies.
For sure. I think John wants to add something. You can go ahead. Oh, John, I think you're muted.
Well, of course I am. Someone had to be over the course of this call. So you don't actually need to do that much in the very traditional, like simplest version of a private equity buyout fund, like a time limited buyout fund acquisition. Let's say you're buying a company for 40% equity and 60% debt. If you hold the company, you don't even grow that much, but you pay down that debt over time, and then and fully pay out the debt while you own it. you can sell more or less the same company that you bought, right, and double your money, right? So it's so the use of debt allows you in the traditional buyout fund form. You're not doing anything good for the company, right? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go along. But you can keep doing that over and over and over again, like Jim said, without really changing the company at all, just by leveraging and deleveraging over and over again.
So that brings me to my next question, and I think Jim can answer this, John can chime in too. What if you're an employee at a company and you find out that your business or the business that you work for has been acquired by private equity? How can you prepare for these long-term changes?
Yeah, I can, so I can talk a little bit about sort of what employees should expect at private equity owned companies. There was probably the one of the broadest studies of kind of impacts on employees was a 2019 Harvard Business School, University of Chicago study that found that private equity takeovers result in significant job losses. This is obviously this is looking at U.S. companies. So 4.4% on average in the 2 years after a company is bought by private equity. Their singular focus of private equity firms is to increase cash flow, right? One way to do this is to decrease labor costs. That could be through layoffs or not filling vacancies. In the case of, for example, medical or veterinary practices, it might include using fewer employees with higher certifications. It can lead to cost cutting on things like employee safety. Back to sort of Rachel's comment on debt, right? The larger share, kind of larger share of the sort of larger amount of debt means that the company has more debt service to pay, right? Which then competes with other things like investing in employees, for example. We also, the employees might see, obviously changes in day-to-day processes or overall strategy at the company, right? I'd mentioned before, private equity firms almost always acquire companies in such a way that they have control, right? So, they want to change the kind of day-to-day processes, kind of overall strategy of the company for the benefit of their investments. And then I guess I would just add, because they rely on so much debt, private equity owned companies are also more likely to go bankrupt, right? So these can obviously lead to significant layoffs for employees. In the U.S., we looked at this just for the first 6 months of this year and found that private equity was behind about 2/3 of the largest bankruptcies, of the bankruptcies over $1 billion during the first 6 months of 2024. So obviously, potentially substantial impacts on employees at private equity.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to follow up and say, do you have any advice for how they can prepare for these changes in job security? As you said, the potential of bankruptcy is pretty high. What can they do? Are there any tools out there?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of notes, right? I mean, we firmly believe that, right, employees are the ones who make money for the company and know its operations best, right? So they'll often be the first ones to notice changes that, when a private equity firm takes over. Private equity firm may install a new CEO or other executives at the acquired company. Employees should be attentive to sort of new experts showing up to understand company practices or strategies or processes, or staffing changes at the acquired company. If employees are unionized, they should alert their union. If they're not, they should consider organizing a union. I think also, to the degree possible, we referenced a significant amount of debt, higher likelihood of bankruptcy. Employees should pay attention to, dividends that the company is paying out. This can be difficult to do, right? These are not always disclosed publicly. They usually happen when a company refinances its debt, but trying to stay on top of the financial situation, because often we see very substantial changes to the kind of financial situation of the company, both after when it's acquired by private equity, and then sometimes over the life of that private equity ownership. The employees should also, I guess, be aware that we haven't talked about them much, but private equity frequently utilizes what are called roll-up strategies, or essentially where they buy one company and use it as a platform to acquire other companies. So they might see significant acquisitions of other companies during the period of ownership. Let me stop there.
Sure. I'd like to turn it over to Brendan now. Brendan, you wrote a book about private equity called Plunder, and why don't you start by telling us what motivated you to write it?
Yeah, so like a lot of people who wrote books, mine started during the depths of quarantine when we all had a lot of free time on our hand and we sort of ran out of episodes of Tiger King to watch. So I got really interested in private equity because just reading the news. I'm based in the United States. Reading the news here, it was kind of amazing to watch the number of acquisitions that were being publicly announced, just the general public, by firms that are familiar to the folks on this call, folks familiar to the folks that are listening in right now, but weren't familiar to me. Blackstone, Carlyle, KKR, and so forth. These were mysterious entities, and it seemed like they were taking over whole swaths of the economy. Now, that got me started just sort of researching out of curiosity, essentially. And it made me realize that there were sort of numbers to back up those anecdotes, and that's what sent me down that rabbit hole.
For sure. And how does then a private equity firm benefit from potentially bankrupting its own company? How is that possible? What are the laws that make it possible? And how can they win from this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I should say, of course, that I'm speaking in a purely personal capacity here. So, I think Jim and John and Rachel have already started to touch on a lot of the sort of general issues in the private equity business model and how a private equity firm can benefit even when its portfolio company loses. So let me just add a little bit of color on that from a legal perspective. So, for instance, I believe Jim mentioned the investment horizon of a private equity firm. So, a private equity firm generally buys up a business, tries to make some changes, or to John's point, doesn't make some changes, and tries to flip it for a profit, maybe 4 or 6 years later. Because of, and again, I apologize for having a myopically United States focus here, because of the way that our tax system is structured that incentivizes investments in debt rather than in equity, and because we really give preferential treatment to capital gains so long as you hold an investment for a really short period of time, just a year, private equity firms have a legal incentive to invest really just for the short term, not for the long term. So that's just one example. Jim also mentioned fees. He went through a number of them. I'll mention management fees, which I think he said, which is a fee that a portfolio company will pay to the private equity firm simply for the privilege of being owned by it, or transaction fees, which are fees that a private equity portfolio company will pay anytime it does a big deal. Well, these are fees that the private equity firm gets, and they are very hard to claw back in bankruptcy. So even when the target company goes bankrupt, the private equity firm oftentimes gets to walk away with that cash. Now, the last point on sort of legal incentives here and why private equity firms might benefit even when their companies fail is a lot of you may be familiar with what's called the 2 and 20 business model, which is how private equity firms generally are compensated. It's how hedge funds are generally compensated. And what it means is a private equity firm is generally entitled to 2% of all the money under its control from its investors every year, and 20% of the profits from the companies that it buys, right? The issue is that while a private equity firm gets 20% of the profits from its portfolio companies, it gets 100% of its fees. So what that means is oftentimes a private equity firm specifically will have an incentive to extract more and more money out of a business, even when doing so hurts the business's long-term or even short-term profitability, because it gets all of that money. And again, that money is very hard to claw back in bankruptcy. So those are just a couple of the issues that we've got. But the general point here is that I think private equity firms are really responding to the legal and regulatory system that surrounds them. And that's what often creates these bad outcomes.
Don, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing on. A few of us have said these companies are normally held for 4 to 6 years, and someone listening might say, well, okay, I mean, if the company's going well, why don't they hold it for 20 years? And what we haven't talked about is the structure of these funds that are time limited in nature, right? So when I raise money for my private equity fund, I promise to pay back my investors within 10 years, right? That's like and I can extend it maybe for a couple of years, but I have to do it. So I have 2 or 3 years to buy companies. And then I have, as we've said, 3 to 5 years to run them. And then I have 2 or 3 years to sell them. So there's actually a forced requirement to sell these companies at one point, which leads to some of these behaviors, right? So if you're like halfway into your mandate of owning something and you're like, I'm not going to be able to sell this thing, it's going badly. Then you shift to, how do I extract as much value as I can, knowing that it's going to go bankrupt anyway, and how do I prepare for that? So it's not like there's no intention, I'm going to buy this thing in order to bankrupt it. But the way the fund is structured, if you get to a point where that's where it's going anyway, then you're going to try to take as much money as you can on the way down.
Yes, it's like totally different from like public markets where you're investing for the long run, right? Like there's a short-term investment horizon here. So Brendan was talking about a very American issue. I want to go to a super Canadian problem, which is our productivity crisis. And some people say that private equity can be a tool to bring money into the economy, encourage business investment. Rachel, what do you think of this argument? Isn't it good for big firms to be investing in business? And isn't private equity's focus on efficiency good for Canadian productivity?
So I love this question. So much so I wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail about it. In order to spur productivity, we actually have to spend money in the economy. We actually have to invest in our businesses. And so buying a company at 10% of its value and then using 90% debt is the antithesis of productive investment. We're actually just taking cash flow and putting it in the hands of investors at the expense of the economy. There's one tactic that's particularly troublesome that I'd love to discuss right now, which is the dividend recapitalization, which is a tool out of the private equity playbook that is counterproductive to investment. So what this is, and it goes against everything we know about business, that we invest in businesses and we grow them. But this new trend in private equity is called a dividend recapitalization. And what this is they'll actually go get the business to just go take out a loan. They'll figure out what's the maximum payment per month that this business could support. So let's say this business, and I'll use the mathematical example I used before. Let's say that this business can afford to spend $100,000 a month in loan payments. So then they'll figure out, okay, well, $100,000 in loan payments is about $10 million or $9 million loan. So then they'll go get a $9 million loan and write themselves a check for $9 million and dividend it back to themselves. And that means that this company has that burden, that cash flow burden of $100,000 every month that they can't invest in the economy. And that money just went into the pockets of an investor. And so where it becomes particularly troublesome for Canada is that more likely than not, our investors are not Canadian. So American investors represent an overwhelming majority of PE investment in Canada. And there's also investment from all areas of the globe. CPP is doing most of their investment outside of Canada. So this is really a global industry where we're all plundering each other. And so they're coming in and they're going to extract this cash. Like it's no different than a gold mine. If we think about, a mine and extracting ore and raw materials out of a mine, we're extracting cash. And so we think about who is extracting. Okay, well, if they're Canadian, maybe they're spending their money in the Canadian economy, but more likely than not, they're not Canadian. And so they're not spending their money in this country, and we're not rising all boats. The money is just leaving the country. And so in order to spur productivity, in order to, grow our economy, we actually need to invest in business. And so that looks like upskilling labor. This looks like, investing in capital expenditures, in machinery, in research and development. We do not do any, or not any, but we don't do a lot of R&D in this country. A lot of our growth is coming from more mergers and acquisitions. And so much opportunity, there's so much opportunity in investing in these companies. And that's kind of where, the wealth will hopefully trickle down as we've been promised. But we need to invest in companies in order to be able to grow the economy. And so if we're just extracting value and not growing, so effectively we're allowing these businesses to create cash, but then we're taking it out before we can invest it and grow it so that everybody else can prosper. So it's very extractive and doesn't grow in the long term. And back to what, Jim and John and Brendan were talking about, it's short-term thinking. We've financialized the private markets to operate more like public companies, which run on quarterly earnings reports. We need to be taking a long-term focus, investing in research and development. And, private equity, as much as they have the swaths of capital to invest, their playbook is run short-term. And so if they want to change the playbook and invest long-term, yes, there's huge opportunities to grow so long as it's focused on short-term gains and extraction. The Canadian economy is really not going to benefit from this. Yeah. John, do you want to pipe in?
Well, just one of the perverse, especially from a Canadian perspective, one of the perverse aspects of this is how when a private equity buyout firm buys a Canadian company, that's considered foreign direct investment, right? And celebrated, right? So we'll have the Minister of Finance saying, look how much foreign direct investment happened in Canada. And if that FDI is a business buying a Canadian company for $50 million that has no intention to build a factory or to hire more people or to do anything that might drive, improvement in that business, that's not useful. That is unproductive foreign direct investment. So these are all the different building blocks that private equity will point to and say, look, we're investing in your country. That type of investment is not an investment in the way that normal people think about investment. They think about building a factory, right? None of this is building a factory. This is just buying our stuff. So as we think about what are the ways that we need to change the narrative on private equity, this is one of them, right? Where this is not foreign direct investment that we want.
Oh, Rachel, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. So one thing I think is really important to talk about too is what, investment. So if you're only spending 10% to buy this company, so we think about the playbook on the leveraged buyout and how we're only putting 10% down. So if you think about it, if I buy this business for $10 million and I'm only putting $1 million down, if I destroy this business and take it down to $5 million in value, if I only invested $1 million, I've still made a decent return. And I think a lot of people forget that you have to actually grow a business to get a return on investment. In this financial model, you can actually destroy it and still come out with a multiple of 4 or 5 times. So it's not as clear as it seems that you invest and buy factories, like John said. You can actually do some big damage and still make a lot of money. And so that's why it's really important to take this investment with a grain of salt, because there's opportunity to actually do a lot of harm to the economy, while some investors have made out like bandits.
So I'm wondering, John, and Rachel talked about this, the fact that, you know, companies owned by private equity don't really have to disclose their financial results as often as public companies do. And wouldn't that mean that they don't really have the pressure to meet quarterly targets and they can think more of on the long term? Um, isn't that technically good?
I mean, it would be if that's how it worked in practice, but unfortunately, it doesn't work like that in practice. And in fact, we'll walk through a couple of typical private equity business models, but investing for the long term is almost always actually counter to the time-limited buyout funds strategy. So look, just stepping back, when people talk about what makes a good company, what makes a good economy, they will often talk about the importance of having a long-term outlook, right? And that means capital investments like factories or new machinery or research and development that may pay off over, say, a 5, 10, or 20-year time horizon, thinking really long-term. And I remember in business school, we'd often talk about the pressures of quarterly reporting on publicly traded companies and how it didn't lead to long-term thinking. And we would always characterize that as, really bad. And in theory, a private, a buyout fund has a longer term time horizon, right? They don't need to report on a quarterly basis, as was mentioned, and they have a whole period of 5 to 7 years, which seems like a long time. But when you understand the business models of the buyout funds, you realize that long-term investments are almost impossible. So in a roll-up, there's just no time for it. And this is the one I'm most familiar with because I've been involved in roll-ups and I've been to my, whatever, talk about that later. But in a roll-up, everyone's energy is spent on acquisitions and integrations, right? Which are complicated because acquisitions are often in different geographies with different cultures and different IT systems. There's also no money for it. The whole idea is to show the next buyer how easy it is to keep growing. So every dollar is spent on new acquisitions, right? In a roll-up, there's nobody who is thinking about what the company or the industry might need 10 or 20 years from now. And even if they did, there's no money to do anything about it. Now, the more traditional and simpler buyout strategy is the one I was mentioning before, when you're buying a company for as much debt as possible and then paying down the debt with that company's cash flow, and then you sell it to another private equity company who does the same thing. This is sort of the treadmill of leveraging and deleveraging that the buyout industry has put thousands of companies on throughout North America over the last couple of decades. To do that and these are, I think it's important to understand these are not stupid people, right? These are smart people who have a certain set of incentives where these are useful and thoughtful strategies for that specific set of incentives. But to do that strategy successfully, you have to be really focused on preserving cash to pay down debt, right? You may have a year or two at the beginning of the hold period to think about growth, but it just doesn't make sense to make an investment that isn't likely going to pay off until after the hold period, because when you go to sell, the next private equity company isn't going to give you any credit for that long-term thinking. And the other part of it that I think is useful to understand is that there's nobody in a leadership position at the company who's likely to advocate for a long-term strategic investment with their buyout fund owners. And I think it's important to understand their incentives. So one of the first things a fund will do when they buy a company is they will offer the CEO and the CFO a stock option package that's tied to the sale of the company, right? They're not going to pay them a lot more. They're going to say, if we can successfully sell this company, you're going to get paid. And so the buyout fund will call this aligning incentives. Okay, so management will then focus their energies on the 5-year or whatever it is exit price rather than the longer term strategy. And if they do a good job, the next fund that buys the company is going to ask them to stay on and do it again, right? And if you're a CEO and a CFO, if you can survive 3 or 4 of these sales, they'll end up with massive amounts of money because they've been paid on exit. I mean, sometimes in the tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, right, for individuals. And so, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of incentive. That's what you're going to do. And as a result, there's now a whole industry of recruiters who look for CEOs and CFOs who are well suited to the grind of the buyout ownership cycle rather than the long-term strategic, programming of a business, because that's what the buyout firm wants. These are really talented people, but they'll pursue this career path, not because they're passionate about it, but because it's the clear path to greatest wealth. And, I think it's important to understand these are not bad human beings, right? Like a lot of us in this world are motivated by financial gain. That's okay. That's part of the system. And I know a number of these people, and it's just hard to ignore these incentives. And all of this is a problem for the economy, right? We can't just rely on the startup community for innovation and investment. We need mature companies to be consistently investing in innovation and growth. But more and more of these companies are being absorbed into the buyout fund, where the incentives are aligned entirely against the kind of long-term investments in innovation that we need.
Rachel, do you want to chime in?
So I just wanted to chime in on just, roll-ups and, what they are in more detail. So a lot of what's happening here is on Main Street, dentists, vets, funeral homes, some of these I've talked about. I was very involved in a waste management roll-up in one of Canada's biggest garbage companies, or now North America. So industries that were highly fragmented, independently owned. And now what's happening is the business community is seeing that there is an opportunity in combining, harmonizing expenses, and then having businesses operating all over a geographic area with, the harmonized costs. So what that allows is for a business to scale and operate more efficiently. And you know what? That's not a bad thing if you think about it. But then the opposite of that is, well, our competition bureau has a threshold of $93 million. And so anything that falls below that threshold, the competition bureau is not looking at. And so this is coming up to like death by 1,000 cuts, because all of these acquisitions are not within the scope of our competition bureau. So it could be that these companies are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they get too big. And once it's too late, that's when the competition bureau would start to get involved. And so we're building these conglomerates out of what traditionally were just, your dentist or your physiotherapist, mom and pop shops, and lawyers and medical or healthcare practitioners. And so I think it's important for us to see what's happening, because as the consolidation continues, it changes the face of Main Street. It changes the face of business, which is, a lot of our day-to-day interaction, going to, your massage therapist, your dentist, your daycare. Private equity is everywhere. And so the more and more it expands, the more small business is dying. And I think it's really important that we understand that side of roll-ups as well.
Brendan, I think you had your hand up.
Just very briefly to echo Rachel's point, I think it's so important to emphasize, there's a lot of discussion about how these roll-ups change the nature of employment. When you talk about roll-ups happening, oftentimes the justification is efficiencies. And what that really means is oftentimes layoffs. I think that's been well covered in a whole bunch of different industries, whether you're talking about, as Rachel said, dentists, veterinary practices, OBGYNs, and so forth. But just to emphasize a point that I think Rachel was making at the end here, it's not just changing the nature of employment, it's also changing the nature of ownership, which is, a generation ago, small towns, medium-sized cities had a lot of distributed ownership. You had the person that has a single practice dentist office, a person that owns their veterinary practice, a person that owns, one or two or three vacuum repair shops. I think one of the really interesting things for a lot of exactly the reasons that Rachel mentioned, which is a lot of these things are happening at thresholds far below where regulators in any country are aware of. As a result, really a lot of these things are becoming centralized, and the profits are flowing to entirely new sets of people. And I think in some ways we haven't quite grappled with the economic or political consequences of that.
I'm wondering if you or Jim could comment on, and I know that a lot of the people tuning in today are work for the healthcare sector, and I'm curious, what makes the healthcare sector particularly attractive to private equity funds? If you could
Jim, do
talk
you want
about
to
the
start
impact
off?
in the US as well.
Yeah, I can name a couple of factors, right? So, right, from a sectoral perspective, at least within the U.S. context and the context of an aging population, right? This is there's a trend toward greater utilization of healthcare, right? So there's a kind of macro trend that firms are following. Healthcare is also seen as a sector that is often kind of recession resistant, right? It's a sector that there'll be continued utilization even in the context of economic downturns. Also within the U.S. context, which I'll speak to, it continues, at least particular parts of healthcare, if you think about doctors' practices, things like that, to be very fragmented. So there's lots of opportunities to do these types of roll-ups that John and Rachel and Brendan were talking about, because you might have an opportunity to consolidate ownership in a particular specialty in a particular geography, or across multiple geographies. And so I think those are at least some of the characteristics that make it especially attractive for private equity.
I'll just add, I think one of the things that we see is there's a big attraction to parts of the healthcare industry that receive regular government payments. So, nursing homes are a famously attractive industry for private equity. And in the United States, that's because those, residents are paid for in large part through Medicare and Medicaid. So to points that John and Rachel were making, so much of the work of the private equity acquisition is paying off the debt that financed that acquisition in the first place. And so if you have money coming in the door every month, it's a way to service that debt and maybe pay down the principal. But as we were saying earlier, as a result, that money's not going towards investing in employees, investing in infrastructure, investing in the future of the company. Instead, it's being used to finance an acquisition that's already happened.
Rachel?
Yeah, I just want to jump in here on long-term care homes, which is quite prevalent in Canada too. Obviously, the healthcare systems are different cross-border. Great work being done in the US and the DOJ investigating private equity's role in healthcare. But some anecdotes that I've been able to see from research is actually that private equity has an increased usage of antipsychotic drugs in long-term care homes, and it's to keep labor costs down. If you think about how atrocious that sounds, to keep people like in their beds and docile so that they can keep labor costs down. Increased mortality rates. I think the study I read said 20,000 deaths pre-COVID, this was a pre-COVID study, were attributed to private equity ownership of long-term care homes. And so as the boomers get older and more people are going to be using long-term care homes, I think it's really important for us to figure out how we want to structure them, public or private, or even private equity owned, because this is a real cause for concern.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I really want to spare some time for solutions so we can talk about how businesses can move forward and just wrap it all up. So let's start with Brendan. What is your agenda for reining in the private equity industry? Why do you think it's so important?
Yeah, so, to try to synthesize some of the things that we've been talking about today, I generally put the challenges of the private equity business model into three buckets, and we've been able to touch on certainly the first two. One is investing for the short term. We've talked about the problems with that. The second is, buying companies with a lot of debt and then extracting all these various fees. And then the third, and we touched on this a little less, is this idea that private equity firms are very good at insulating themselves from the legal consequences of their actions. So a private equity firm may dictate that, staffing be slashed at a nursing home, somebody dies at an understaffed facility and sues the private equity firm, there's a very good chance the private equity firm is going to be able to escape that lawsuit. And in fact, we have examples of where that exactly has happened. And when you combine all of those problems, short-term thinking, reliance on debt and fees, insulation from liability, you have a real economic situation that sort of is a heads I win, tails you lose game for private equity firms. So how do we change that? Once again, here in the US, I think that there's a lot that can be done at the federal level. Obviously, Congress can act if it chooses to. Things can be done at the regulatory level to try to get private equity firms to take more responsibility for their actions, to be a little less extractive in their use of debt and fees. But ultimately, I think a lot of action here is going to happen at the state and local level here in the United States. We have, 50 states. What you could have is any one state could say, sure, private equity firm, you can make an acquisition of a business headquartered in our jurisdiction or based in our jurisdiction. But if you execute a dividend recapitalization, like Rachel said, or if you do a sale leaseback, and as a result, the company fails or people lose their jobs, well, then we are going to make sure that the private equity firm is financially responsible. And if you connect the dots there, if you hold private equity firms responsible for the consequences of their actions, I think they're going to behave a lot more responsibly.
How about you, Rachel? What is your solution to changing private equity's course?
So a lot of what Brendan said, aligning risks and rewards. So, if you're going to be playing with fire and taking out a lot of debt, you've got to be able to backstop that debt and not have the taxpayer or your suppliers and customers, unsecured creditors, paying for your risky behavior. We all take risks in business, but you got to bear the brunt of those risks as well. What I would love to do is give PE competition. So right now, we've got $2 trillion worth of Canadian businesses that are going to be sold over the next 10 years. And the biggest buyer, and really the only buyer for those businesses, is private equity. And so of that $2 trillion, $1 trillion is going to be sold to third parties. So $1 trillion of Canadian business value is up for sale. We need to have viable alternatives to private equity because these businesses are going to be sold. There is a booming M&A sector in Canada and all over the world that there's no way these businesses are not going to be sold. So what we need to do is utilize things like employee ownership trusts that John has been such a champion of, and Social Capital Partners has been such a champion of. But we also need to provide abilities for just entrepreneurs to buy these businesses, or Canadian businesses to scale and acquire them. Because if we continue to be selling all of these businesses to private equity, one, we are going to lose our entrepreneurial culture. The small, medium-sized businesses that are the bedrock of this country are going to be lost. And they're going to be lost to this corporatization and financialized environment. And that affects the community. This is not just about maximizing returns, but we've got to think about what kind of country we want to live in and how we want to engage and patronize businesses. So yeah, those are some of my solutions.
John, I'm hoping you can talk a bit about employee ownership trusts, expand on what Rachel was saying, and also, if a business owner wants to sell their business, what options do they have today?
Oh,
John, I think you're muted.
I'm trying to do as often as I possibly can. So look, selling to employees through a trust is definitely a real option where it exists. It's great that it now exists in Canada. The UK introduced a tax-incented employee ownership trust a decade ago, and now 6% of all transactions in the UK, which is more than 300 businesses a year, are selling to a trust where the financial outcomes are going to workers instead of to investors. The problem is the other 94%, right? Many of whom are still being sold to buyout funds in the UK. And look, I think despite all that we've said today, the answer isn't preventing private capital from buying businesses. right? If we did that, more companies would just sell to competitors. They are, also a primary buyer of companies, and that increases market concentration, creating some of the same problems that buyout funds do. I think what we need to do is focus on the time-limited buyout fund and what the incentives are for people to use those. And I think we can look to the tax system to help us do that. In most Western countries, capital gains are taxed at a lower rate than dividends, right? That means the incentives are geared towards buying and selling of assets rather than holding them long term. And we've seen that play out as buyout funds have exploded during the low capital gains tax regimes of the last 20 years. If instead, tax system prioritized dividends over capital gains, investors would shift their preferences according to those incentives and would shift towards more longer-term investments. That change in investor demand would then shift the behavior of private capital managers away from these quick exits and toward longer-term holds, which is what we want. So the tax system can be used for that. We can also change how interest is treated. Right now, when a buyout fund uses a company's debt, like we've talked about, to buy that same company, the interest is tax deductible, right? So that means we are all subsidizing the use of debt that makes our companies and our economy less resilient. If we stopped allowing that, leveraged buyouts would become less attractive and opening up more debt capacity for productive uses like buying equipment and doing R&D, right? Like overall, we need an economy that builds organically rather than just buying and selling. And our mature companies need to keep building as well. Our tax system currently incents the opposite. It incents the buying and selling of assets. And if we could shift that incentive towards building, that would have a big impact on where the buyout fund sits in our economy.
And finally, Jim, I want to ask you about what do you think the role of public policy or grassroots organizations is in pressuring firms to be more accountable, more sustainable, and have more equitable practices? And if you can draw on your experience about your organization, the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, that'd be great.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, so the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, like I said, the main watchdog group focused specifically on private equity. Our focus is working together with workers, communities, tenants, others impacted by private equity buyouts. We have seen substantial impacts of private equity across a variety of areas, right? On climate change, we were part of a consortium that recently found that private equity firms are responsible for something like 1.2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions annually, more than the global aviation industry. And they're frequently buying up sort of dirty energy assets that other companies are shedding. Private equity firms are now the largest residential landlords globally. So, buying up apartments, single family homes, et cetera. The particular sort of egregious example that we worked on a couple of years ago, in terms of impacts on workers, the U.S. Department of Labor in 2023 found that Packers Sanitation, a company that cleans meatpacking plants, owned by Blackstone, the largest private equity firm in the world, was using over 100 children in conditions of oppressive child labor, cleaning plants on overnight shifts. The largest investor in the Blackstone fund that owned that is Canada Pension Plan, is CPP, right? So, you can kind of see there's these direct ties to significant real impacts on people. We think that supporting efforts of workers, tenants, others, organizing and collective action where possible is critically important, right? To hold private equity firms accountable, to make sure that that people are telling their stories of impact. I just would also just say, like, this dialogue about private equity tends to operate in kind of it's kind of wonky and it's opaque, and nobody really, it's not something that's central to most people's day-to-day lives, although we're increasingly seeing impacts on more and more people's day-to-day lives, right? If you're a millionaire, or you're not a millionaire or a billionaire, you might not have heard of private equity before, but is increasingly impacting your life. And so I also think critically important is, you know, kind of telling stories of the impacts of private equity. We have started to see, you know, major investors put in place, pensions and other investors put in place standards around labor or climate or housing for private equity. So I'll just stop there.
All right, it is 1 p.m. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for your time today. Thank you to Social Capital Partners and CAMP, and thank you to everyone tuning in. It was a really great discussion, and I'm really grateful to have had the time to spend talking about this with you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.